Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us on Continuing the Conversation. I'm your host, Aaron Merchant, Senior Director of Early Childhood Education, Policy and Programs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. I've got the distinct privilege of Dan Wuori joining me today. He is, in fact, the first guest that we've had on this podcast series that was not on stage at the National Child Care Innovation Summit. However, many of his ideas and his fingerprints were all over some of the stories that we heard. Dan, you have been in the early childhood space for a long time. You were a kindergarten teacher. You were the director of early learning at the Hunt Institute, and now an author on the daycare myth. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention how you're a little bit internet famous with your adorable videos of little kids and kind of explaining the neurology but behind those milestones. And so I've kind of given some highlights, but can you let us know like what brought you to this field and what motivated you to write this book before we dive in?
Absolutely. It's first off, it's great to be with you, and I'm always glad to see you. You know, I have had the good fortune to be working now in the early childhood field for more than 30 years. I have served at what I describe as almost every level or every rung of what we call the early childhood career ladder. I actually began my career outside of education altogether. My initial college degree is in broadcast journalism. Worked in radio for a number of years here in Columbia, South Carolina, where my family resides. And it was, during that time that I very much by accident actually had some exposure to the world of working with young children. A family friend ran an after-school childcare program locally and found herself in a real bind, invited me, sort of in a panic. It was a request more than an invitation as to whether I could come and help her out maybe while she was short-staffed for a couple of days. And, I always say, Aaron, it took about 15 seconds for me to realize that I had made a terrible mistake in life and was really intended to work with and for young children. And so went back, as you mentioned, pursued graduate studies, became a kindergarten teacher, was a school district early childhood administrator. The piece maybe you didn't mention is that I spent almost 15 years as the deputy director and sort of de facto chief of staff at South Carolina's early childhood agency, which is called First Steps. And so, it was during that time that I had my first real exposure to the policy side of the conversation. Got to work closely along with our state legislature, for well over a decade on the major early childhood policy conversations that were happening in the state. Helped to not only create but to help to oversee during its first dozen or so years the state's mixed delivery pre-K system. Had many other legislative conversations about the needs of children and families. And so that's what led me, as you mentioned, to the Hunt Institute. The Institute is located in Cary, North Carolina, just outside of Raleigh, and was the brainchild of Jim Hunt, who was the four-term governor of North Carolina. It is an education policy support to the nation's governors and state lawmakers primarily. And so really for the past 6 years or so now, I have traveled the country working with gubernatorial administrations, with state lawmakers all across the country on improving early childhood policy. And a big piece of that obviously here has been the conversation around the needs of the nation's childcare industry, which is really what prompted me to write the book. The last piece of that puzzle is that last December I spun off creating this consulting business of my own. It's allowed me a little bit more time to sleep in my own bed here in South Carolina, and so that's sort of where all this has happened and unfolded over the past couple of decades.
That's fantastic. It sounds almost like the early childhood field was more of a calling than a job. You were sort of despite your best efforts to look for something to do over here, over there, it was always going to be early childhood.
I think that's true.
Dan, with the daycare myth, it was it was a choice to use the term daycare in the title. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. And I also want to talk about, so we've got the daycare myth, and then you talk about a crisis of understanding. You said we've got within the childcare sphere, a crisis in cost, a crisis in staffing, but what it boils down to is a crisis in understanding. So can you speak a little bit about, why you chose the term daycare in the title and how that connects to this crisis?
Absolutely. I recognize, Aaron, that the title is maybe a little bit deliberately provocative in this way, and viewers who may not work day to day in the field may or may not know the word daycare has actually fallen very much out of fashion, at least in the field. That there is a popular saying, we don't care for days, we care for children, and so we have seen over the past couple of years, largely in the field, sort of a shift away from the term daycare and more toward childcare. The myth in question, though, is that this thing that we have conceptualized as daycare even ultimately exists, right? I think the book raises the point that for the better part of 100 years now, we have maybe created a false dichotomy in which we envision that the earliest years of life are a time for care, whereas education begins a little bit later. I've worked with policymakers all across the country who have articulated this vision that that children will come to school ready to learn, or come to kindergarten ready to learn, as if that is where learning begins. And the book is really sort of about the disconnect between what we know from the science of early development and how it is enacted, or maybe in some cases not well enacted, in our public policy. And one of the prime places that I sort of seize on in the book is this question of really, when does learning begin? We know it doesn't begin in kindergarten. And we know more so even that even to say that learning begins from day one is becoming a bit of a misnomer in and of itself. There is a fascinating kind of emerging body of evidence in the field that points to some very important learning, in particular in terms of language learning, that is happening even in utero, right? That young, newborn babies who have only been in the world for a couple of hours already, certainly demonstrate an awareness of their own mother's voice, and that they demonstrate a preference for kind of the rhythms and the patterns of their mother's native language, absorbed very much in utero. And so, to your point around the title, the book sort of raises the question of that we really don't have this thing called daycare that maybe we have thought of as being just sort of a safe, warm place for children to be kept while their parents are at work, as separate from a learning environment. We know that all environments for young children are learning environments, and the real distinction here is just how good are they?
I think that's an excellent point, Dan. This is not me, but I can't remember where I heard this, but a quote that I've kind of carried with me is that children are going to be learning in an environment, just like they're going to be in an environment, and they're going to learn from it, like regardless of where they are. So it's our responsibility to make sure that it is an appropriate environment, right?
Absolutely, and I want to be clear too. The intent here is not in any way to disparage the concept of care. In fact, care is life giving and can be life saving for young children. Young children need our care in abundance, but we are fooling ourselves into thinking that these are not also incredibly important learning environments. And so the real challenge, both for parents and subsequently in our public policy, is to recognize that as parents are selecting an early childhood setting, particularly those outside of the home, they need to recognize that they're not selecting a babysitter. That they are, in essence, selecting the adults who will help to co-construct their children's brains. And that's a very different proposition that has very different implications for how we might handle this in public policy.
And when you talk about public policy, Dan, I loved how you framed it as the three Ps, right? You've got parents, providers, and policymakers. What do you see as maybe a disconnect between one or more of those groups? And in the daycare myth, how do you propose those three stakeholder groups work together to find a solution that works?
Well, you're right, Aaron, and you've hit on, maybe ambitiously, the book sort of targets those three reader audiences. And the way that we have sort of squared that is that at the end of each of the book's major chapters, there is a section that we call the bipartisan blueprint for change. And the idea here is that, the chapter itself, lays out a case. But at the end of the chapter in this particular section, I speak directly to each of those three audiences. So if you're a parent, what does the content in this chapter really practically mean for you as a reader of the book? And importantly, if you are a policymaker, what are the implications? In all of those roles, we have different spheres of influence, for example. And so, whereas parents may take this information and be very interested in it in terms of selecting an early childhood setting for their children, policymakers have the opportunity to really think through how these systems are working at the state and the federal level, how they are funded, and all sorts of implications at the policy level. So the book attempts to speak directly to parents, to policymakers, and to the early childhood workforce in related but sort of separate ways.
And I think we've seen the concept of childcare policy really raised to center stage in many ways, whether it's on the to-do list of the C-suite, CEOs, CHROs. It's come up a number of times in the current presidential election. I know that in many states where they're having state and federal elections, that childcare has come up in many different ways and shapes. Out of curiosity, Dan, I wonder, and this is not like every single time, this is not every single situation, but I think there has been at times in the sort of gestures broadly childcare advocacy community a stress point between what is able to be accomplished now and what is needed, right? And I'm wondering what not like, how do we fix this or that, but like, what is your viewpoint? What is your take on the idea of sort of incremental progress as it pertains to supporting the childcare field, parents, providers, kids, in many cases, employers, that incremental progress, whether it's like a tax credit, maybe it's an expansion of eligibility for benefits, versus the wholesale sort of, whether it's investment or reconfiguring that many think is necessary.
That's a really important question, Aaron. And I think, I have worked, and I know you have worked in policy long enough to know that very infrequently do we see wholesale sort of changes enacted across systems in really quick and sweeping ways. But I think the book makes the case both for change in the long term and the benefits of doing that. I mean, ultimately, the book makes the case that what the nation needs is a really transformative approach to funding for young children and families, but simultaneously makes the case, one, that we're already paying the price of the system we need, just doing it in all of the wrong ways. And so makes this sort of long-term case for why we need to rethink the way that we're approaching this, but also highlights, from my recent work with state legislators and governors, a whole list of ways that our public policy right now may actually be undermining even the success of the early care and education industry in this country. And so, I think the book calls out, sort of identifies a long-term vision, but also provides ample opportunity for what you're talking about in terms of incremental change, things that we can jump on right away that are low-hanging fruit in the policy world.
And I think, Dan, very much to your credit, one of the great things about the daycare myth is that it really scaffolds. Like, it starts with you could have not thought about childcare at all and pick this up and then understand the core tenets, or you could have been working in the childcare or childcare policy field for years and learned something new in the book. And so, Dan, I wanted to see, is there one last either like fun fact or maybe a question you want to leave the audience with, a final salvo before we wrap up?
Well, gosh, I think, Aaron, the main point of the book is that we have inadvertently created what I have been calling a bizarro world for children. I don't know how much you or viewers sort of follow the world of comic books. In the DC universe of Superman, there is this place called the Bizarro World, which is the opposite of Earth. In fact, its name is actually Earth spelled backward. Instead of being a sphere, it's a cube, and day is night, and up is down. And there's actually a Superman in the Bizarro world, except instead of being a hero, he's a villain. And the case that I have laid out and would continue to put in front of people is that we have, through our inaction and in many cases inadvertently, created a bizarro world for young children. We know, for example, that during precisely the weeks and months of early life where attachment and stable, nurturing relationships are most important, we know, for example, that 1 in 4 American mothers actually has to return to the workforce within 2 weeks of giving birth, interrupting that that nurturing attachment. We know that parents are paying more for childcare than for in-state college tuition. We know that the professionals that we rely on to be those brain builders and early childhood programs around the country, in many cases, are making at or near their state's minimum wage. As a matter of fact, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're making roughly 60 cents an hour less than dog walkers in this country. And so when you lay out the facts around the system we have now and juxtapose that against what we know about the science of early development, that we know, for example, that the period from prenatal to 3 is the single most consequential window in all of human development. The mismatch becomes very clear, and it begs the question of what are we going to do about it? And in particular, begs a question not just for the parents of young children, but for each and every one of us as taxpayers, even if we don't have young children currently or children at all. Frankly, we are saddling American taxpayers for decades and decades to come with the poor outcomes that are generated as a result of our inaction during the years of early childhood. And so the book is ultimately sort of a call to take a pause, to re-examine what we know from the science of early development, and give a really careful reconsideration as to how we have structured our public policy around children and families.
Dan, I don't know if you could have wrapped a bow on that better if we gave you 100 tries. That was both eloquent and to the point. And Dan Wuori, can't thank you enough for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Aaron, thank you for having me.